You're listening to the Decisive Podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision-making. Hello and welcome to the Decisive Podcast. I'm Kristen Hallam, your host. Our focus today is on the Asia-Pacific region, which has held 3 significant elections this month in Japan, Thailand, and Bangladesh. In the current geopolitical environment, these outcomes have the potential to shift alliances and influence policy at the regional and global levels. In this episode, we will dive deeper into the election results and analyze their implications for government stability, economic policy, and international relations. Joining me for this discussion are 3 experts from our Asia-Pacific country risk team at S&P Global Market Intelligence. Jeffrey McElroy, Senior Analyst, Ayman Othman, Country Risk Analyst, and Smriti Premjit, Country Risk Analyst. Thank you all for joining us today. So, where are we likely to see the greatest shift in policy direction and geopolitical strategy?
Hi, Kristen. I think that's definitely Japan. So first, I would like to emphasize the magnitude of the electoral victory that we saw only 2 weeks ago for Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi and the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. Our economist Harumi-san described the LDP's performance in that election not as a landslide, but rather a, quote, megaton-class avalanche, just to give you a sense of how big it was. We saw the ruling party expand its representation in Japan's lower house from around 40% to nearly 70% of seats, giving them a supermajority. This represents the strongest performance of the LDP in the entire post-war period. I just want to emphasize how much of a remarkable turnaround this is from the situation we were in only a few months ago, where Prime Minister Takaichi led a minority government by a razor-thin margin, in some cases by a single vote. Fast forward to now, the party controls all major parliamentary committees, meaning they can smoothly pass budgets and major legislation in the lower house. They can also override vetoes from the upper house. Most importantly, this is going to provide stability for Takaichi's government and policy continuity for Japan in the foreseeable future.
Wow, that is quite a turnaround, Jeff. What were some of the key drivers in that election? What motivated voters to go to the polls?
It appears like the LDP's victory was really driven by the personal popularity of Takaichi herself, which clearly had a lifting effect on the party nationwide. So since becoming prime minister in October of last year, Takaichi has enjoyed unusually high levels of public support, up to 70% according to some polls. This is way beyond what we usually see, even during the honeymoon phase, where a prime minister usually enjoys higher support. And with Takaichi, the highest levels of support, believe it or not, were found in younger voters, so 18 to 39-year-olds, which is also a very new dynamic for the LDP, which has struggled with these demographics in recent years. And I think these numbers reflect how effective she has been in presenting herself as a different kind of candidate than we've seen in a long time. Of course, she's Japan's first female prime minister, but is also someone who has effectively marketed herself as outside of Japan's established political dynasties. And I think that positioning registered with voters looking for reform from within the LDP. Of course, she now has to follow through with that mandate.
Yes, indeed. So, with that in mind, what are the post-election priorities likely to be for the new government, Jeff?
Well, the immediate focus is going to be on passing the 2026 budget before the end of the current fiscal year, which is March 31st. We are expecting the budget to include fairly significant spending increases. So this is what Takaichi has referred to as a, quote, proactive fiscal policy. This will include investments in 17 sectors identified by the government as priority sectors. And these are things mostly in high-tech industries like AI or semiconductors. Also sectors where the government wants to build strategic autonomy or supply chain resilience, so like aviation or shipbuilding or defense-related heavy industries. Now, regarding defense, we're also expecting significant increases in defense spending to over 2% of GDP this year. The potential problem here is that Takaichi has also proposed record Social Security spending and economic relief measures targeting households. So notably, this includes a temporary tax cut on food and beverages, which, if implemented, will reduce government revenue by an estimated 5 trillion yen per year. This, of course, is driving market concerns over fiscal sustainability in Japan, which has been reflected in some of the swings we've been watching in the bond and currency markets around Takaichi's victory. Now, we think that smooth and timely passage of that 2026 budget, where they are expected to clarify funding sources for these programs, will likely help to address some of these concerns moving forward.
All right. Well, you've given us a pretty good picture, Jeff, of the, domestic situation. What would you say are the regional and global implications of the election outcome?
Fairly significant. So Takaichi has long emphasized, even before becoming prime minister, China as a security concern for Japan. And this perception was certainly amplified in November when she commented during a parliamentary session that, in her opinion, an invasion of Taiwan would represent a quote unquote survival threatening situation for Japan. So this in turn, of course, led to significant backlash from mainland China, including curbs on tourism and the reported blocking of some rare earth exports to Japan. Now, the commercial impact of this dispute thus far has been limited to specific sectors, so mostly tourism, but we are expecting overall Sino-Japan relations to remain chilled for the foreseeable future on the back of Takaichi's election, likely as long as she is in power. Now, this will be especially the case if she aims to more explicitly position Japan as a regional counterweight to China or aligns even more closely with the U.S., especially on issues like Taiwan. I will say that some of the hawkish tendencies of the administration that have been highlighted, mostly in international media, have likely been overstated. So after making those comments in November, Takaichi has shown restraint and a willingness to at least not allow relations to deteriorate even further. However, one potential escalation point we are monitoring focuses on proposals under the Takaichi government to amend Japan's constitution, and they now have the votes to do this, specifically Article 9, or the Pacifist Clause. So this would be a largely symbolic gesture, but would almost certainly be perceived by China as a step towards Japan's remilitarization and would very likely result in further straining of diplomatic ties. On the other hand, Takaichi's victory will likely have a stabilizing effect on Japan-U.S. relations, with the administration hedging towards alignment with the U.S. on security issues, so things like defense buildup and reducing critical dependencies on China, so rare earths and magnets, for example. Of course, one question is Japan's response to that recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling overturning Trump's use of IEEPA tariffs. Thus far, the Japanese government has indicated that it is not looking to renegotiate its trade pact with the United States on the back of that ruling, including its pledged $500 billion in investments in the United States. We are expecting more clarity around U.S. tariffs and those investments coinciding with the planned summit between Prime Minister Takaichi and President Trump in Washington, D.C., which is scheduled to occur in March.
All right. That's coming up. So what do the results mean for businesses, Jeff, both domestic and international? You kind of hinted at it there, but what more can you tell us?
Well, I think clearly firms in those high-tech, high-growth industries identified by the government as priority sectors are going to benefit from state-led investments in the coming years. However, on the other hand, continued volatility in Japan's bond and currency markets is likely to increase borrowing and import costs for Japanese manufacturers. So addressing those fiscal sustainability concerns will be very key for the administration early on. In terms of foreign relations, as I indicated before, Takaichi's victory has really reduced chances of a quick thaw in relations with China, and this will be a concern for Japan's fairly significant commercial interests there. This is not just in terms of bilateral trade or input dependencies on things like rare earths, but also Japanese manufacturers, which have a large operating presence in China. Thus far, as I mentioned, we have not seen the ongoing dispute spill over into these more commercially significant areas. For example, as occurred in 2010 around this dispute with the Diaoyutai and Senkaku Islands, where you saw anti-Japanese riots shutting down factories in China. So that hasn't happened yet. But multinationals with Japan or China implicated supply chains should definitely monitor for developments in that relationship. There's a somewhat rosier picture for the U.S.-Japan outlook, U.S. tariffs notwithstanding, with a high likelihood of close alignment between both governments in key areas like supply chain and economic security, though the competitiveness of Japan's traditional export industries, so things like autos or machinery, these are going to rest on Takaichi's ability to manage that relationship and continue to secure tariff exemptions from the Trump administration.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Iman, let's bring you into the conversation and talk about Thailand. What were the election results there, and what do they mean for government stability?
Thanks, Kristen. The headline result from Thailand's election is that the Bhumjaithai party, led by caretaker Prime Minister Anutin Charnvirakul, secured 193 seats in the 500-member House of Representatives. This is a huge victory for Anutin's Bhumjaithai party, which actually secured just 71 seats in their last showing in the 2023 election. Since then, Bhumjaithai party has gained the backing of Phua Thai. This is the party linked to the Shinawat family, which now holds 74 seats. Coalition talks remain underway, but Anutin's Bhumjaithai party is very likely to lead a new governing coalition, which is reported at around 295 seats, which would give him a comfortable majority in the House. What is notable is that previously polls have suggested that the reformist People's Party might perform better, but in the end, the party came in second with about 118 seats. The People's Party is actually the successor to the Move Forward Party, which won the largest number of seats back in the 2023 election, but it was blocked from forming a government when the military-appointed Senate refused to endorse its prime ministerial candidate. So what does this mean for government stability in Thailand? Bhumjaithai's win gives Anutin a very strong mandate, and their conservative, pro-monarchist values align closely with the royalist military establishment in Thailand. This alignment reduces the risk of Anutin's administration being ousted by the institutions, which have been a source of instability in the past. Coalition building, like I said, is still part of the equation, but Bhumjaithai is very likely to include establishment-aligned parties, which should reinforce administration stability.
All right. So, what are the post-election priorities likely to be for the new government, Iman?
We assess that a Bhumjaithai-led coalition would likely pursue broad policy continuity, particularly on public welfare and investment facilitation. The new government is expected to focus on easing the cost of living pressures in Thailand, one with the continuation and expansion of the Let's Go Halves shopping subsidy program. It was first rolled out during the pandemic, and it was later revived under Anutin's minority government, now covering 60% of the cost of certain food and goods. Another priority is debt relief. In November last year, the government launched a restructuring program for more than 2 million non-performing loan accounts, and Anutin has signaled that this will remain the focus to help households and small businesses manage their debt burden. The new government will likely prioritize regulatory simplification. This is exemplified by last year's fast-track framework under the administration's Quick Big Win policy to accelerate more than 70 large-scale investment projects in Thailand. In terms of infrastructure, the Anutin administration is likely to encourage the use of public-private partnerships or PPP and the Thailand Future Fund to finance large-scale projects, including the Southern Economic Corridor, or better known as the Land Bridge Infrastructure Project that aim to bypass the Strait of Malacca.
All right. Thank you for that overview of the domestic agenda, Iman. So, what would you say are the regional and global implications of the election outcome in Thailand?
First of all, Anutin's Bhumjaithai campaign leaned on issues of sovereignty and border security, and these themes resonated with voters. So we assess that this will likely translate into a firmer line on the border conflict with Cambodia, as reflected in the hardening stance that is expressed by Anutin. For example, On February 7, just before the vote, Anutin pledged to cancel the 2001 Maritime Boundary Framework, also known as MOU 43. This MOU was meant to guide talks over overlapping maritime boundaries with Cambodia. Then, on February 10, after the party's win, he instructed the caretaker cabinet to begin preparing for its repeal, citing the lack of progress under the agreement. He has also spoken about pursuing construction of a proposed border wall and also to keep border checkpoints with Cambodia closed. Additionally, Bhumjaithai's election victory makes it highly likely that the military will continue to play a significant role in border operations, given that decision-making authority was granted by Anutin in November last year. As for the global implication, we assess that continuity in leadership under Bhumjaithai-led coalition, it points toward broad policy consistency, and the party's alignment with the Senate is expected to support policy predictability since a simple majority is required for the passage of bills, and most Senate members are reportedly aligned with Anutin's Bhumjaithai party.
So, Ayman, what would you say that means for businesses, both domestic and international?
When we look at the business implications locally, the focus on easing cost of living pressures, as well as the debt relief, it directly affects consumer spending and small enterprises. This will benefit local retailers, F&B outlets, and also other consumer-facing businesses. The Bhumjaithai's proposed support for SMEs through low-interest loans and also assistance with digital expansion will also be beneficial. Meanwhile, for the international companies, the strong push for public-private partnership in major infrastructure projects while driving economic activity is also likely to favor large, well-capitalized domestic and international corporations.
So let's move on now to Bangladesh. Smriti, what were the results there, and what were the main drivers of those election results?
Thank you for having me, Kristen. The Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the BNP, won a two-thirds majority of seats at the parliamentary elections that were held in Bangladesh. These were the first elections held since an interim government replaced the former Awami League government, led by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, after a student-led protest movement ousted her government in 2024. Now, the Awami League has been one of two parties, along with the BNP, who was central to Bangladesh's politics since its inception in the 1970s. So when the interim government essentially banned them from participating in these elections, the main question was if there would be an effective opposition political party going forward. Now, the BNP, led by the now Prime Minister Tariq Rahman, was successful even in former Awami League constituencies, winning close to 55% of the total national vote. Jamaat-e-Islami, on the other hand, won close to 40% and will now lead the opposition. Given that the Jamaat were a banned organization under the Awami League until 2024, they have very quickly consolidated support since the ban was lifted by the interim government shortly after they came into power. The BNP's campaigning positioned the party as centrist compared to the now opposition leader Jamaat-e-Islami, which is a hardliner Islamist party. The Jamaat-e-Islami's campaign, however, focused on addressing corruption, which seems to have appealed to the younger demographics, which is reflected in the party's success at the politically influential student body elections, which took place throughout 2025. In contrast, the National Citizens Party, formed by the student leaders who actually led the 2024 protests, failed to consolidate the same support, even from younger voters, and had to form an alliance with the Jamaat-e-Islami. A voter turnout at close to 60% significantly reduces the likelihood of contested election results in the future. This, combined with seemingly implicit support to the election outcome from army leadership, who have previously led multiple coups in Bangladesh, supports an outlook of improving political stability over the next year.
All right. Thank you, Smriti. 60%, that is an impressive turnout for sure. So what are the post-election priorities likely to be for the new government, Smriti?
Political discourse since the ouster of the Hasina government has focused on a need for reforms. Along with the national elections, voters also voted in favor of the July Charter, which includes 84 provisions providing for widespread constitutional and administrative reforms. These include increasing the president's power, introduction of an upper house, and limits on the prime minister's term. The new government will likely prioritize the implementation of these reforms for the first 6 months of its office, given that it is time-bound. The BNP's supermajority in parliament will enable quick policy passage. However, in the scenario that the reforms are delayed, which is a possibility given disagreements between the B and the Jamaat over some provisions of the charter, these policies are likely to be deprioritized until the reforms are implemented. In the one-year outlook, the government will also likely focus on strengthening investor confidence, especially in anticipation of potentially losing their least developed country status in November this year and the accompanying trade concessions. To this end, the BNP has emphasized deregulation through reducing regulatory oversight and through digitization, particularly in the key sectors of ready-made garments, energy, pharmaceuticals, and in manufacturing.
Right. Thank you. And what would you say are the regional and global implications of the election outcome in Bangladesh?
The BNP has stated that it is going to look at a Bangladesh first approach that will guide the country's foreign policy. Prime Minister Rahman's public statements so far suggest that this translates to pragmatism and balancing relationships with the country's neighbors without aligning with a single country. This is likely aimed at positioning the BNP in contrast to the Awami League, which was perceived as having a preference for closer trade and diplomatic relationships with India. Trade cooperation with Pakistan, which saw a resurgence under the interim government following decades of strained relationships under the Awami League, will likely see further improvement. The BNP will also seek to repair some of the erosion in trade relations with India that occurred during the term of the interim government in Bangladesh, primarily through attempts to restore access to land routes between the countries. While China continues to be one of the country's largest trade partners, if the US Bangladesh tariff agreement holds, it would significantly limit further trade avenues between Bangladesh and China. The Bangladesh-US tariff agreement requires Bangladesh to adopt so-called complementary restrictive measures to align with US policies and enables the US to exit the agreement if Bangladesh were to enter trade agreements that could, and I quote, undermine US trade interests. This could potentially affect new agreements with China, Russia, and India. That said, the new government has indicated that it will seek a review following the US Supreme Court tariff ruling.
All right, lots to keep an eye on there, Smriti. Thank you for that. So, Smriti, what would you say this means for businesses, both domestic and international?
For businesses, BNP's majority win signals improving political stability after 2 years of uncertainty in government and policy. Bangladesh is likely to pursue a policy focused on increasing foreign direct investment through easing regulatory burden in the energy, manufacturing, ready-made garments, and pharmaceutical sectors. Prime Minister Rahman is likely to seek diversity in the country's energy production and reduce dependency on imported energy sources. This will likely facilitate opportunities for investments in oil and gas exploration and in renewable energy production. Businesses previously associated with the former Awami League government will likely continue to face higher scrutiny for perceived unfair contract terms, and this is likely to include a potential review in utility tariff rates. The tariff agreement with the US will be consequential for domestic businesses and is likely to lead to a reduction in subsidies, especially for state-owned enterprises in the agricultural sector. The risk of protests and riots remains high, at least until reforms are finalized and implemented, given that the Jamaat has significant grassroots influence and ability to mobilize large-scale protests to pressure the government and amplify their demands. Improving political stability over the next year will reduce the risk of protest-related disruptions extending beyond 2 days at a time.
All right. Thank you so much, Smriti. So it's time to wrap up our conversation. We've covered a lot of ground in a short period, so I think it would be helpful for each of you to provide a key takeaway or two for our listeners. Jeff, let's start with you.
Yeah, key takeaways here. I think on the back of this really historic electoral outcome for Takaichi, I would like to stress that now the administration is tasked with following through on this clearly expansive mandate that they've been given. And so managing those relationships with China, managing the increasingly volatile relationship with the United States, and then getting a handle on Japan's own domestic market volatility that we've been seeing are things that the administration is going to have to confront this year.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Over to you, Ayman. What would be your key takeaway on Thailand's election results?
My key takeaway from Thailand's election is that Anutin Charnvirakul and the Bhumjaithai party's decisive victory gives them a strong mandate to govern. Their conservative and pro-monarchist positioning reduced the likelihood of resistance from the royalist military establishment. Leadership continuity and also the new coalition's alignment with the Senate suggests steady policy direction and also a predictable policy environment, particularly in areas like public welfare and investment facilitation. For Thailand, this result points to a period of relative political stability at home. The economy and GDP growth will be front-burner issues, but regionally, the risk of localized armed incidents or resumption of a broader border fighting with Cambodia remains high in the one-year outlook.
Thank you for that. And last but not least, Smriti, what's your key takeaway on Bangladesh's election outcome?
For Bangladesh, the continued acceptance of the election outcome by opposition parties and by the army leadership will be the primary driver of stability. This, coupled with the timely implementation of reforms, will determine political stability and reduce the risk of renewed political violence and protests over the next year.
Right. Thank you. All that's left for me to do is to thank you, Jeff, Ayman, Smriti, for sharing your insights with us today. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. If you'd like to dive deeper into the topics we've discussed today, please click on the links in the description of this episode to access our latest thought leadership. Until next time. Thank you for listening to the Decisive Podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.